By way of introduction, I'm Francis Park. I am the Strategy Development Division Chief over the Joint Staff J5. All right, so I come to you from a somewhat unusual place, not the least of which is that the overwhelming majority of my education is in history. What little that is not is in social sciences. I don't claim to have a shred of STEM, and as you can tell, my basic branch is not intelligence, signal, or cyber. That said, I am responsible for national strategy and their associated assessments, and it's instructive to look at where cyber fits within that. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about certain things that are coming down to the joint planning and execution community. The current national military strategy was signed on the 11th of November, 2016. It's the first classified one since the Cold War. The great thing about that is that as the chairman rolls out portions of it in public, we can actually talk about it in public. And so, to some degree, we're the beneficiaries of that. But it serves as a framework for a series of changes in how the Joint Force organizes and prepares to address the challenges for the future. So the centerpiece for the new NMS is something called global integration. So with no further ado, next slide, please. So I refer to you the problem statement on the left. Since the end of the Cold War, we have generally looked at operations within a single combatant command area of responsibility. That's a consequence, I would argue, of not having faced a peer competitor since the end of the Cold War. So what I offer then is, if you look to the right side, there are a couple of implications that come with the problem statement on the left. First things first, I'm going to talk about the 4+1. 4+1 military challenges. Secretary Ashton Carter, former Secretary of Defense, he talked about a number of priority challenges for the joint force. The 4+1 refers specifically to Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations. One of the paradoxes of any future military strategy is that you're making an educated guess on what you think you're going to have to get in the future based on the challenges that you're going to face. You have no guarantee that you actually know what you're going to face. You have no guarantee that you're going to be able to predict with any certainty what you think you're going to have to buy. So you're going to have to make some bets and hedges based on that very imperfect guess of what you are going to face in the future. Now, the 4+1 priority challenges are not the only view of the future. They are, however, a representative enough view of the future where we think that any force that we make that comes out of those 4+1 challenges will be able to respond to whatever challenges that we face. Now, I would offer that traditionally the U.S. military has deterred successfully those adversaries that we seek to deter. We didn't go live against the Soviets during the Cold War. And for the most part, our deterrence efforts have been successful. Generally, we end up fighting adversaries that we don't plan. Afghanistan in 2001 is probably the best example. But the force that we fought OEF and OIF with was essentially built over the 2 decades prior to that. So to look back at OIF, for example, at least the beginning of OIF-1, the track record for conventional militaries taking on the U.S. in conventional armed conflict is generally not good. Actually, Operation Desert Storm is probably a better example. But because of that, because of our conventional superiority, our adversaries are going to seek to turn situations to that which our traditional strengths don't necessarily apply. And so if you look at the full range of military operations, there's been a significant trend towards competition below the level of armed conflict. So you see this with little green men in Ukraine. You see this with artificial reef construction in the South China Sea. And frankly, you see this every day in cyberspace. The things that we see every day are generally done so that they preclude a traditional military response. The other thing that I offer, and if you look across regions, domains, and functions, because we have traditionally fought along combatant command lines, we also tend to fight generally internal to a combatant command. Now, anybody can go on YouTube, anybody can go on Google and go find the map of the Unified Command Plan. Our SEAMs are a matter of public record. And so, there were articles in the 1990s that talked about combatant commands virtually being proconsuls, and the considerable authorities that they wield, however, tend to be localized to their combatant command areas of responsibility. So one of the things that we need to think about is how do we better integrate, our planning, decision making, and resource allocation processes so that they're not just localized to one AOR. Next slide, please. So this is, in essence, the public-facing version of much of the themes that are in the National Military Strategy. So the first thing that's up there is a trans-regional, multi-domain, and multifunctional environment. And I offer that because that's really the basic reason for global integration as a construct. Because we've had traditional successes within combatant command AORs, our adversaries have adapted to being able to operate amongst those themes. So it's very unlikely that any threat that we face, the Russians are probably the best example, but any other of the 4+1 problem sets that we face are not going to be localized to any one combatant command area of responsibility. When we talk about multi-domain, the Joint Staff's corporate view to domains is that there are 5 of them: land, sea, air, space, and not coincidentally cyberspace. And then multifunction. You have certain functions such as global strike, special operations, ISR. Many of the things that we take for granted in the U.S. military are now capabilities that our adversaries are being able to increasingly employ across a global, or at least trans-regional scope. So I talked a little bit about the 4+1 priority challenges already, and that, as a strategic framework for the joint force, that represents, the changes in strategic direction to the armed forces and changes in how strategic and contingency planning are working are being done principally through those lenses. Now, I say principally because that's not, we're not writing our future strategy and strategic planning solely against those threats. And so, but that forms much of the basis of our approach in the future. So that leads us to the 5 missionaries. And so, like any good strategy in the Department of Defense, it's some combination of ends, ways, means, and risk. The 5 areas that you see on the right represent the ways of the National Military Strategy. And so assurance, deterrence, deterrence of conventional, deterrence of WMD, competition, and response. If you look at a number of other military strategies, there's a lot of nuts and bolts that actually look fairly similar to ones that we've had in the past. The biggest difference of that probably is in competition. And so because our adversaries are looking to compete with us, we can't afford, if you look at our existing planning doctrine and our previous strategies, much of them have been predicated on the notion of a binary view of peace and war. There's phase 0 and then there's phases 1 through 5. However, our adversaries don't fight in that manner, and I think they recognize that a binary choice is not going to work, and hence the notion of competition. So the role of the military, of course, the military is not going to be the lead institution for all of that. Some of that will also involve interagency cooperation. And so a true view to competition, especially on a day-to-day basis, requires a degree of integration with other instruments of national power that we can't take for granted. So to talk about global integration, so the heart of global integration is really the role of the chairman in his role in providing best military advice to the President and the Secretary of Defense. And so if you have a chairman who does not by law sit in the chain of command, you have in essence an honest broker who can not only by law oversee the activities of the combatant commands, which is something that's delegated or designated to the chairman in Title 10, but also someone who can look at multiple combatant command AORs and concerns at a global scope rather than a regional one. I expect combatant commanders to be parochial about their areas of responsibility. It is their job. And they should lobby as hard as they can for their missions within that context. The chairman, on the other hand, has a broader perspective because his purview is the entire joint force. So, with that said, the last thing that I offer for the national military strategy is that of allies and partners. In a nutshell, I would say if you need a friend and something bad happens, it's too late to make one. So the role of allies and partners, and the chairman has said in a number of statements, both in print and writing, or both in print and spoken, allies and partners are our center of gravity. And if we really think about what we're looking to do, we can't do this alone. And so much of the things that we look to do, we just, as a rule of thumb, the U.S. does not fight unilaterally. So what does this mean for cyber? Good question. Next slide, please. So I invoke Shakespeare at the very top, or Aldous Huxley, depending on who you look at, because, cyberspace, maybe a domain. Forces don't necessarily fight the same way in cyberspace as they do in physical space, in land, sea, or air. And so one of the things that we face, especially in a time where military strategy is changing, concepts are in flux, doctrine are in flux, is that there's a considerable amount of new ground to be trodden or to be set out. Now, in theory, concepts should inform doctrine, should inform experimentation. In many cases, though, strategy has been outrunning concepts, and so we're playing catch-up ball in ways that don't necessarily fit what we've done in the past. And so that creates a challenge not only for those who write the strategy, but also those who are going to do the concepts that take us far beyond the normal strategy years, and those who are responsible for teaching it, and the ones who are responsible for developing the doctrine that gets taught. So one of the things I offer is one of organization. So right now, I will admit I haven't kept close tabs on it. How do we envision cyber forces being put into a joint force headquarters? So we have joint force land component commands, air, and maritime. Space has been swallowed in a number of different things. What's going to happen with cyber? I offer this because at some point there may be a requirement to build some of that specialized expertise. But we see some of this, for example, with SOF. Joint Special Operations Task Forces have eventually evolved into combined force or joint force special operations component commands because of the demands that are levied on a joint force to be able to employ SOF. And I would argue that's a potential way ahead and I say potential because that remains to be seen. So the other thing that I offer is leader development and personnel. And so I cringe every time I hear someone who's been raised in conventional venues say, well, just CNA it. And I die a little bit inside every time I hear that, because that begs the question of, is that a very episodic, a very tactical employment of cyber in a way that belies some of the basic nature of how action happens in cyberspace? Well, that would require that some old dogs need to learn new tricks, and that's frankly tough. I freely cite myself as a relic of the last century, for example. And so, how do you generate the people who are going to be able to lead the force in ways that are relevant? At the flip side, you also have, how do you make specialists relevant to the joint force? And so there's a paradox that I generally see, and this is something I was actually talking to Joe Billingsley before we started. So you have folks who are proficient in cyber who may not have the education, background, or temperament to go work strategy. At the same time, I lose count of the number of strategists who run screaming in terror from any discussion of cyberspace. And so that's a gap that frankly needs to be filled. And I get it. I mean, all of my degrees are in the humanities and social sciences. That does not exempt me from having to think about how does a joint force fight in the future. So, I offer that making the right people over time, and I mentioned, how do you teach old dogs new tricks? Well, the other thing that's a stopgap for is that how do you grow the next generation that's going to be in time? And so if you're going to make a battalion commander, that takes about 15 or 16 years, and that's after commissioning. You could argue that how do you make the people, and that's not just officer expertise, that's across the entire cyber enterprise, both officer, enlisted, warrant, civilian, etc. That is not an academic discussion, and it's something that, as you look at how you build the cyber force in the future for a globally integrated force, it's something that you need to look at. So I offer to look at the right. Do these words really mean what we think they do? And so this is where I invoke the Princess Bride. I do not think that word means what you think it does. And so cyberspace doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists for the demands of national policy. How that reflects in national strategy and theater strategy, of course, is something that's going to continue to evolve over time. But operational art is something that, for example, has not been addressed in cyberspace, and I think that's actually some fairly fertile ground for theoretical work in the future. Tactics, on the other hand, may mean something very different to someone who is raised in the traditional force versus someone who's raised in the cyber force. Joint operating areas are another example. Things that exist in cyberspace don't cleanly fit inside physical boundaries. So, and that's actually one of the things that perhaps any vision of how we fight, our laws, our policies, our doctrine are all predicated on more or less geographic separation along combatant command AORs. And so what happens, for example, when I'm sitting in Central Asia and I decide to, for some reason, because I was bored one night, I decided to trace route my internet connection. It went way outside of Afghanistan, well outside of the AOR. And if that's happening for civilian transports, then that makes me wonder, how does that affect things that are happening in the operational force, not only for us, but also for our potential adversaries, which also, and I could argue the same thing about theater of operations. So all of this being said, so why do I quote Shakespeare in the bottom right? So from The Tempest, Miranda has been sitting on an island most of her life, and she sees new people, and that's what she says. And Prospero immediately responds, "'Tis new to thee." And so I make that statement just because Huxley, when he wrote Brave New World, is telling a cautionary tale of there are capabilities that we know are powerful and wondrous, but we haven't really explored the full extent of what that entails. And that's a challenge, and that's a charge that I would throw back out to the force. Much of that needs to be done. Much of that also needs to be done in a way that makes the rest of the people who don't live in cyberspace on a regular basis cognizant of how best to employ the force. So, with that said, thank you very much.